Thank you. Sorry about that. So the Center for the Mobilities Cluster is housed under the Center for Migration Studies. Our research in the broader Center for Migration Studies aims to understand the complex challenges and opportunities for governments, societies, and the international community with regards to global migration. Through our research groups, projects, initiatives, and affiliated courses, the UBC Center for Migration hopes to share our expertise with key stakeholders, including researchers, policymakers, immigrant and refugee service providers, and the public. Our research is interdisciplinary in focus and includes everything from migration, governance, immigrant integration, and national identity formation to the politics of belonging, migration narratives, immobilities, and the relationship between indigeneity and migration. I'd like to thank the co-sponsors for this talk, which is the Department of Classical, Near Eastern, and Religious Studies at UBC, as well as the staff at the Center for Migration Studies. As you just heard, this event is being recorded. Once we get to the Q&A, we'll stop the recording and it will be more informal. If for some reason we forget, as I clearly see, I can't seem to handle Zoom, we'll cut the Q&A portion before we upload the talk. In terms of Q&A, the chat box is open. This is just a regular Zoom session. It's not a webinar, so you can use the chat box to answer questions. I'd like to take this opportunity before I introduce Dr. David Anthony, that Dr. Anthony is also joined by his research partner, spouse, and anthropologist, Dr. Dorcas Brown, too, who will also be handling the chat and handling questions. So we most likely will save questions to the end, but if there's something in the middle and there's an opening and Dr. Anthony wants to address that, that's also fine. So now I would like to move on to introduce our speaker for today. The UBC intellectual community is very pleased to have Dr. David Anthony deliver a virtual talk for us today. Dr. Anthony is Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at Hartwick College in New York. He has been at Hartwick since 1987, and he's also currently an associate in the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University, working in David Reich's Ancient DNA Lab. Dr. Anthony's conducted extensive fieldwork in Ukraine, Russia, and Kazakhstan, and he's a renowned expert on the archaeology and language systems of the Eurasian steppes. His 2007 monograph, The Horse, the Wheel, and Language, How Bronze Age Riders from the Eurasian Steppes Shaped the Modern World, examined how the original Proto-Indo-European speakers of the Eurasian steppes transformed the cultures and societies of Eurasia via their domestication of the horse and the use of the wheel. And it was winner of the 2010 Society for American Archaeology Book Award. I'd like to quickly highlight two major articles that Dr. Anthony has produced and which has direct relevance for his talk and for migration interests at UBC. The first is his 1990 article in American Anthropologist called Migration and Archaeology, the Baby and the Bathwater. In the mid-20th century, archaeologists had really turned away from studying human migrations for reasons I won't get into. And Dr. Anthony wrote this extremely influential article detailing how we could and why we should be studying human migration as archaeologists. This article really helped to open the floodgate in the 1990s for a return to archaeological interests in migrations, and it's still a classic. Flash forward pretty much exactly 25 years. In 2015, Dr. Anthony, as part of an interdisciplinary team of researchers using new techniques in genetics, linguistics, and archaeology, co-authored an article in Nature arguing for the original Indo-European speakers in Europe as descended from the Eurasian steppe societies. This article was a big splash, and it really demonstrated how interdisciplinary teams drawing from hard sciences, social sciences, and humanities really can do amazing things. And Dr. Anthony is going to delve further into this work with his talk today, How Ancient DNA Revived Ancient Migrations in Archaeology. Please join me in giving a hearty welcome to Dr. David Anthony.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you. And I guess I will share my screen now. I'll say before I share my screen, I'll say this, that Dorcas Brown, who I've worked with my whole career and couldn't do what I do without her, is right next to me. And if you have a question and you want to type it into the chat, she'll be reading those questions and she'll wave at me if there's a question in the middle of the talk, and I can stop and answer questions as we go along. One other thing is that my keyboard has broken, and so I have to use the keyboard on the actual computer that's got the Zoom camera in it. So my hand will be in the foreground in the beginning. There we are, okay. And today I want to talk about how ancient DNA has revived ancient migrations in archaeology. Okay. In the archaeological explanation of culture change, many archaeologists are biased against any hypothesis that requires large-scale, long-distance migration. And this has been true in the past, and it remains true today to a surprising degree. I have here a picture of an image from a 1963 article by Maria Gimbutas, an American anthropologist, on the migrations of the Kurgan culture, as she called it. You can see the Kurgan culture is identified up here, and we have these arrows that are going across Europe, trying to represent an explanation for culture change in these regions. This was probably the last article of its kind that was published in the American Anthropologist, which is the flagship journal of American anthropology. Today, archaeologists and anthropologists would not publish an article like this. This was pretty much the end of drawing big migration arrows on maps and representing migration in this sort of simplistic manner in archaeology. Of course, modern humans migrated out of Africa and spread over the entire planet. But in recent archaeological thinking and in genetics thinking, actually, they were thought to have then stopped migrating, which is an odd position to take, just intellectually. As you can see from this map, the migrations that took anatomically modern humans out of Africa and all over the globe went on for 100,000 years, at least 90,000 years. And then in the last 10,000 years, when almost everything that was interesting that people did, like invent agriculture and kingdoms and states and organize themselves in large communities, and all of these recent developments in human society have happened in the last 10,000 years. And in that period, it was thought that people stopped migrating. And these geneticists, Deshpande et al., in 2009 made a mathematical argument calling this a serial founder effect as a model for human settlement out of Africa, in which people moved to a particular place, pretty much stayed there. A few people then moved to another place. Most of them stayed there. A few people moved to another place. Most of them stayed there. And so there's a series of founder effects to account for the spread, actually, of the distribution of genes in modern human populations. You'll see that this was in 2009. We have a lot more genetic information now. And in fact, this article contained mathematical errors that invalidated the basic argument. But it was, it stood for a long time as an argument supporting the idea that migration, particularly long distance migration, was pretty unusual in the prehistoric past. Peter, I can't see that. Heather. Yeah, Peter Heather wrote this book in 2009, Empires and Barbarians, in which he gave this quote. He's a historian of the period called the migration period by historians after the fall of the Roman Empire. He went to talk to archaeologists before he wrote this book in 2009 to see what they thought about migrations during, quote, the migration period. And this is a quote from his book. A basic equation has grown up in the minds of some archaeologists between any model of the past involving population movement and simple-mindedness. As a recent introduction to early medieval cemeteries put it, avoiding migration and explanations of archaeological change is, quote, simply to dispose of an always simplistic and usually groundless supposition in order to enable its replacement with a more subtle interpretation of the period. Migration has become the great Satan of archaeological explanation. Quite a strong statement from Peter Heather. Why did he say that, and why were archaeologists telling him this in the early 2000s? Well, migration first explained everything, and then it explained nothing. Errors in 19th and early 20th century explanations of the past, there are two big ones that really screwed up archaeological thinking about migrations. One was that migrations were the chief agent of change in prehistory, and often they were represented as violent. There was sort of a dramatic view of the past in which large numbers of people were sort of wandering over the landscape, bringing their culture with them, and then replacing the previous cultures that had been there. And the second supposition was that material culture styles, represented often in archaeology by pottery styles, represented people, so that archaeological cultures represented ethnicities and languages. We now know that this is not true. I show a picture here of pottery, beautiful pottery. It's all from the same archaeological culture, but there's sort of a theme to the decorative schemes. In this archaeological culture, it is the Tripolia culture from Eastern Europe, the Eastern Carpathians, on the edges of the Eurasian steppes. These are people who lived in agricultural villages, say around 4000 BC, and they made these incredible polychrome ceramics. They had a particular house style, they had a particular way of treating the dead, they had particular tools and weapons, and you put all of these things together, and that's how archaeological cultures are defined. Now, archaeologists today realize that the social referent of archaeological cultures is really not understood. We don't understand why exactly people keep the same material culture. We do know that it doesn't necessarily mean they speak the same language or have the same ethnicity. But in the past, that assumption was made, that migrations were the chief agents of change, and that pots equal people and archaeological cultures equal languages. And this is particularly relevant to the problem of the origins of the Indo-European languages and the connection between archaeology and this other problem. The Indo-European languages, this is a diagram of the Indo-European language family. All of these languages are descended from a parent language, Proto-Indo-European, at the top of the diagram. Here's English over here on one side. English is evolved from an earlier language, Old English, which I studied in college. And if you study Old English, you realize that it's very much like German and not very much like modern English. Old English was descended from West Germanic. West Germanic and North Germanic and East Germanic made up the known languages in the Germanic branch. Germanic itself evolved from Proto-Indo-European. Some of the things that really surprised linguists. Linguists put this diagram like this together by, most of this was known by the middle of the 1800s, the middle 19th century. And one of the things that they discovered was that Sanskrit is like Latin. Latin was the parent of the Romance languages, we know that. Sanskrit was the parent of many of the languages spoken in India today. And like Latin, it's a dead language. It's a language of literature and religion, religious texts and legal texts. And like Latin, it's still learned in India today, but it's not the natural language of any population. And so it was quite a shock to discover that Sanskrit shares so many traits with Greek and with Latin that it's impossible to arrive at any other conclusion except that they all are descended from the same parent language. And when this was first discovered in the 19th century, India, for a Western European, or particularly for somebody from the British Isles, India was regarded as sort of the epitome of exoticism. It was on the other side of the globe, Maharajas and jewels and weird languages and spices, and it was just thought to be as far away from an Englishman as you could get. So this discovery that the speakers of Sanskrit were not completely exotic foreigners, but in fact were long lost cousins, just hit European intellectuals like a ton of bricks. It was fascinating. And it led this subject, which seems obscure today, it led this subject to be a very popular subject talked about in magazines and newspapers. The question immediately arose, how did the speakers of Proto-Indo-European, where did they live? How did the language they spoke generate daughters that are today spoken from Scotland to India and by about half the people in the world? When did the speakers of Proto-Indo-European live? Where did they live? And what was the process? What was historically responsible for the spread of the language that they spoke? And those questions have remained unanswered and a subject of research for the last 150 or 200 years, one of the big unanswered questions in Western intellectual history. But unfortunately, as this problem became popular, it also became involved with the imperialism and colonialism and racism that was typical of Europe in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. So that it became a subject of the Indo-European migrations, became a subject of books like Madison Grant's The Passing of the Great Race. When he's talking about the Great Race, he's talking about the white Nordic race, the Aryan race. And this book was essentially Nazi propaganda. It was written in English by an American, but it was studied by Hitler's advisors. It depended on Gustav Kossinna's 1911 book about the origins of the Germans, and Kossinna was an early archaeologist. And Kossinna's view of the Indo-German migrations assumed that not only did archaeological cultures equal ethnicities and languages, but that archaeological cultures equaled races. And therefore, archaeological cultures could expand and move only by people moving, by migration. And this is a diagram from Kossinna's, at the bottom is a diagram from Kossinna's own research, and you can see written here, Heimat der Aryen, the homeland of the Aryans, right there in Northern Europe. He used archaeological evidence to try to argue that you could see archaeologically expansions, migrations outward from Northern Europe into the rest of these regions. And this was used as a rationale for a world conquest and genocide during World War II. So after World War II, this whole topic was just abandoned by most archaeologists for understandable reasons. But it wasn't abandoned by Maria Gimbutas. And so we'll go back to this illustration of 1963 American anthropologist. And what she's proposing here is that is the opposite of what Kossinna proposed. It's not a racist idea that she's proposing, and it's not a Aryan supremacy idea. She's going the other way, that the origin of the Indo-European languages was not in Northern Europe, but it was in the steppes north of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea in what is today Ukraine and southern Russia. And that there were migrations by these steppe nomads outward from the steppes into the rest of Europe that carried Indo-European languages with them. In her version of this migration story, culture A, the culture of the Kurgan culture, the culture of the nomads, replaced culture B completely by migration. There was no real analysis of the migration process. It was just they were nomads, so they migrated, and they totally replaced the cultures in the places they went to. She was following in the footsteps of earlier people who had argued for a steppe homeland for Indo-European. As early as 1878, Otto Schrader had made the same argument. V. Gordon Childe, who's considered to be the father of European prehistory, he died in 1956. He had written a 1926 book that repeated the same argument. So she was following in the footsteps of people who had made this argument before. But does the spread of Kurgan graves really mean the spread of the Kurgan people, the spread of people? And the answer was certainly not certain. She published that article in 1963, but in 1966, a very influential British archaeologist, Graham Clark, published this other article, the invasion hypothesis in British prehistory, in the journal Antiquity. And he greatly criticized British archaeologists for accepting migration too easily. Vague similarities, he said, do not prove migration. And here's a vague similarity. Because you see burial mounds like this in the steppes, and then you see them spreading to neighboring areas, does that mean the people have moved? Or does that mean that the people in neighboring areas have adopted a new religion? Maybe the people in neighboring areas have adopted a new political system. Maybe the people in neighboring areas have adopted a new economic system. There's a lot of different explanations other than migration for why this custom might have spread. So by about 1965, archaeologists had abandoned migrating hordes as a useful explanation for culture change in the ancient past. Internal change, as I was just describing, in a social or political organization or in economy or in technological capabilities were usually considered to be better explanations, and invasions by barbarians were left for Hollywood. And I put not only Conan the Barbarian down there, but also the Dothraki from the Game of Thrones. The Dothraki, by the way, were explicitly based on the nomads of the Eurasian steppes, the Huns and the Scythians, but they're a terrible proxy. They're just what they showed that there's no wagons there. They have to have wagons if they're going to be Eurasian steppe nomads. We don't take them seriously. And that led to this. So here we are in 1968. Maria Gimbutas in the field at Sidigroi, northern Greece. And these 1968 grad students are from UCLA and Cambridge University, two of the best archaeology graduate programs in the world. Of course, I'm not denigrating UCB. Yeah, I'm sorry. And they regarded Gimbutas's Kurgan culture migration theories as already simplistic and groundless. They were learning something called the new archaeology in the 1960s, and she was a representative of the old archaeology. She was very certain that she was right, and they were just living in different eras. And you can see how unhappy they are with her lecture in which she's propounding about Kurgan culture migrations into Greece and Southeastern Europe generally. So these people are just about to go out and get jobs and take over the future of archaeology. And when they did, they overreacted. For them, what was that?
There's a chat thing saying, who took that picture and under what circumstances?
Who took that picture and under what circumstances? That picture was actually published by a friend of Maria Gimbutas's in a article about her after she died in 1994. And what the friend was seeing was just, that's a great picture of Maria. I don't think her friend really noticed what was happening in the background with the students. But I read that article and saw that pic. I got this this picture out of an article by Ernestine Elster, who's a good friend of Maria's, and I don't think Ernestine really noticed what was happening in the background. So when these people became powerful in archaeology, they chained all migration theories to nationalism, to 1960s culture history, and to a normative view of culture, the billiard ball view of culture, in which everybody within, say, the Kurgan culture is all the same. The billiard balls are internally homogeneous and externally bounded. And this was the way that Maria saw the Kurgan culture, but it's not the only way you have to see archaeological cultures. But in the criticism of migration, migration was chained to these three ideas: nationalism, culture history, and a normative view of culture. And we really have to break that chain. There's no logical reason why migration in archaeology has to be used in this way. In fact, by the 1970s and 80s already, sociologists and demographers had recognized that migration affected architecture, gender, food, political authority in different ways. A change in one aspect of culture does not imply a change in all aspects. The whole culture doesn't all change at once. The culture A doesn't simply replace culture B. And these are some of publications that were already available in the 80s that showed how migration affected politics in Africa, how migration affects architecture and American log buildings, how migration affects language. And insights from these could have been imported into archaeology already in the 1980s, but archaeologists were ignoring this literature. So, in fact, the awakening to migration in archaeology began among archaeologists with something that looked like hard science, DNA combined with radiocarbon dates. And this happened with the wave of advance theory of the origins of the European Neolithic. In this theory, it was proposed by Ammerman and Cavalli-Sforza. I have a citation here for their book in 1984 in Princeton University Press, but they had been publishing in journal articles starting in the 1970s, that an advancing wave of migrating farmers moving randomly by random movements with a constant 1 kilometer per year spread could explain the expansion of, number one, radiocarbon dates. The earliest radiocarbon dates for farming were in the Near East and in Anatolia, Turkey. And you can see 6,000 BC dates here, 5,500 BC dates in Greece, 5,000 BC in Southeastern Europe, 4,500 BC in Central Europe, and so on. An advancing series of increasingly recent radiocarbon dates could be matched and correlated with modern marker genes. They didn't really have the lot of genetic evidence available in the 70s and 80s, but they had genes like for blood type. A principal components analysis of the genetic distances between populations using these modern marker genes across the old world seemed to show that there was a climb that went from the Near East out to Northwestern Europe. And they proposed that, in fact, you could see a sort of a vague imprint of the spread of Neolithic populations in modern European genes, implying that there was direct continuity from the Neolithic populations to modern European populations. Almost everything about this has been proven wrong. The dates are wrong. The hypothesis that modern Europeans share genes with Neolithic Europeans is now definitively proven wrong. There's very little genetic continuity between the Neolithic in Europe and modern Europeans. And also, the idea that farmers spread by random movements, that made it amenable to analysis using an algorithm. But it's not the way people actually move. You know, in this audience, that people don't move randomly with respect to direction or distance. And a constant 1 kilometer a year spread, that's something that only would be true if you averaged moves over many thousands of years, but that doesn't tell you anything about how people actually moved or why they moved, how far they moved. Nevertheless, even though this was later proved wrong, it inspired a lot of conversation, and European archaeologists began to talk about migration and the European Neolithic and the movements of farmers. And this opened up a conversation about migration that hadn't been there before, after starting in about the 1990s. And my migration in archaeology, the baby in the bathwater, actually was a response to the wave of advance theory of European Neolithic origins. And in this article, I pulled out a lot of already well-known regularities, commonalities about migration, particularly long-distance migration. And I argued that long-distance migration is a predictable pattern, processual behavior. It's the kind of thing that should have been included in the new archaeology and processual archaeology rather than being kicked out. In fact, migration shows many more regularities cross-culturally than the rise of the state or the adoption of agriculture, which were big subjects that processual archaeologists studied, looking for cross-cultural regularities in human behavior. Here is cross-cultural regularities in human behavior, things like chain migration, that migrants follow kin and co-residents to specific destinations that their kin and co-residents have gone to before, so that the first 10% of migrants to a particular place often can predict the next 90% of them, the source of 90% of migrants who arrive there. And this is why you have single villages in Russia ending up in the same apartment building in New York City. Chain migration is a well-established regularity in long-distance migration. Return migration is another one that migrants usually intend to return often, unless there's really negative conditions in the home area. They often intend to return. They intend to acquire resources and then eventually go back home. Also, whole cultures don't migrate. We all know that only subsets migrate. And what causes those people to migrate is partially that they have information. The information doesn't have to be accurate, but they have access to information about the destination. That information can flow along information channels that keep pulling people from that particular group to that particular destination. And the archaeologists should look at these patterns, and they should look for these patterns in prehistoric remains. And if you don't know what you're looking for, then you're not going to find it. And if you don't study the sociology and the demography and the political science of migration, then you are not going to be able to understand migration in the past. I made this argument in 1990, but by 1990, processual archaeology itself was beginning to morph into other things theoretically, and processual theories themselves were being criticized regularly by archaeologists. So making the argument that that migration should have been welcomed into processual archaeology was actually the wrong argument to make in 1990, but I didn't realize it at the time. Well, Colin Renfrew, Sir Colin Renfrew, Sir Lord Colin Renfrew, right? Yes. He was so inspired by the wave of advanced theory, Emmerman and Cavalli Sforza, that he wrote a new book about Indo-European origins, archaeology and language, in 1987, following the Princeton University Press book. And since then, he has worked with Peter Bellwood, who adopted the same theories, that the origins of Proto-Indo-European was in Anatolia, and that the Indo-European languages spread with farming. Indo-Europeans were projected here as peaceful farmers spreading a new agricultural economy. My book, The Horse, the Wheel, and Language, in 2007, had a completely different argument, that the Indo-Europeans were pastoralists benefiting from a revolution in transport and mobility. And I was following a book, a 1989 book by Jim Mallory, who remains a good friend and colleague. And we believe that the Indo-European homeland was in the steppes. Now, not only is this in a different place from the Anatolian homeland, it's in a markedly different time. If the Indo-European homeland was in the steppes and the languages spread in, say, 3000 BC, as I was arguing, and as Jim Mallory was arguing, by 3000 BC, Europe was full of farmers who had been there for thousands of years, and they were speaking probably hundreds of languages. Rather than an expansion into a Europe that was thinly populated by hunters and gatherers, by a demographically superior population, this is a much more complex scenario in which the speakers of Proto-Indo-European would have to have their language triumph over the languages of well-established farming populations. It's a completely different dynamic for the process of language shift that was responsible. But I really knew that I was right from the beginning because Proto-Indo-European, reconstructed Proto-Indo-European, had words meaning like this: axle. Here's the Sanskrit word for axle, Latin, Lithuanian, Germanic, Celtic, and Greek. Systematic comparison, and when I say systematic comparison, there are rules and procedures for these comparisons. You have to study them in order to do it. It's not just an eyeball thing. But this Proto-Indo-European root can be reconstructed, which evolved systematically into all of these other words. So we can reconstruct a Proto-Indo-European root, hex, which meant axle. And of course, there's only one meaning for axle. All of these words, the meaning for axle is that thing that goes between the wheels and underneath the vehicle. These are the two oldest axles that are known in the world, and they're both dated about the same time, 33 to 3100 BC. And that's because this is when wheels were invented. This is the evidence for the earliest wheeled vehicles in the world. There's written signs in Mesopotamia. There's actual vehicles, hundreds of them, buried under Yamnaya kurgans in the steppes. And then there's a variety of other evidence from 3D models, 2D images, and tracks that come from the rest of Europe. All of these pieces of evidence are dated between 3500 and 3100 BC. There's no evidence for wheels anywhere before 3500 BC. And in fact, a Proto-Indo-European contained at least 5 terms referring to wheeled vehicles. Axle, hex for axle is just one of them. There was a word that meant the harness pole. There were 2 words for wheel, and there was a verb that meant to go or convey in a vehicle. And for instance, Germanic preserved all of these words. Celtic preserved the word for the hortos, word for wheel. It had axle, and it had the verb for go or convey in a vehicle. When you look at this, it's for linguists, it's quite clear that Proto-Indo-European contained a vocabulary for wheeled vehicles. Wheels were widely adopted after 3500 BC, and therefore Proto-Indo-European was spoken after 3500 BC, meaning that dispersal of Proto-Indo-European into the daughter languages starting in 6000 BC, as the Anatolian hypothesis proposed, was impossible. The wheels weren't invented then. Proto-Indo-European did contain the wheeled vehicle vocabulary. The earliest farmers did not have a vocabulary for wheeled vehicles because they hadn't been invented yet. So the Anatolian hypothesis had to be wrong. This dating of wheeled vehicles was also tied to a larger theory that I put out, I described in the book. Horseback riding increased the efficiency of herding 3 times, which allowed steppe people to have much larger herds. And then wagons were mobile homes, which took care of their residential needs. Heavy things like tents, food, water, fire fuel could be conveyed in wagons. And so all of the resources of the river valleys could be taken out into the open steppe, and you could be continuously mobile following a herd. And the wagon was essentially a little river valley that took all those resources with you. And starting with when the first wagons and horseback riding were combined in Yamnaya, all of the settlements in the river valleys were abandoned. And so here was an example from an excavation of our own. There's Dory right there sorting artifacts with Pam Crabtree, a faunal analyst from NYU. This is an excavation in Ukraine. You can see what the steppes look like. That's the occupied terrace there. This particular terrace was a favorable location. It was occupied in 5500 BC. It was occupied by a different culture in up to 3500 BC. No occupation in Yamnaya because they were so mobile that they didn't leave traces behind. And this is typical not only of this site, but of dozens, maybe more than 100 sites throughout the steppes. You lose any record of where they were living because they suddenly became so mobile. And before that, people had lived in these river valley forests, which are full of resources, and they had fished in the rivers. Starting with Yamnaya, all of these riverine sites are abandoned, and you begin to see kurgans out on the steppe plateaus, which is the great majority of the Eurasian landmass. The Yamnaya people figured out how to domesticate the steppes and exploit the huge reserves of bioenergy that are preserved in the Eurasian grasslands, and they were the first people to do that. In the process of our excavations, we excavated quite a few kurgans. Here you can see the mound. This is the Russian technique for excavating mound graves with a bulldozer. We had no control over the use of the bulldozer. But once they got to actually down to the level at which the graves are found, they were much more careful, and they hand excavated those graves. You can see that happening right here. That's how most kurgans in the steppes have been excavated with bulldozers. We got a nice chronological series of 66 human bone samples. We got radiocarbon dates, and we got dietary isotopes to show how the diet changed through time. And then after we got that data, we put the bone samples in a drawer at Hartwick College, and that drawer closed and stayed closed for 10 years until we were contacted by David Reich, who had developed this new method for obtaining whole genome data, whole human DNA from fragmentary bone remains. S.K. Willerslev used a different technique, but was getting the same kind of results from the University of Copenhagen. And the two of them were racing towards publication. And the editors of Nature decided to put them both out in the same issue in 2015. It was a remarkable issue. And just briefly, I won't explain the whole thing, but 99.8% of the genome is the same in all humans. And what the Reich lab does is target the specific parts of nuclear DNA that vary significantly between modern humans. These polymorphic parts of the human DNA are called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. And the Reich lab now captures about 1.2 million targeted SNPs that code for hair color, skin color, stature, lactose tolerance, various genetic disorders, family relationships, and more distant ancestry. This is just an amazing revolution in archaeology. This is just incredible. We can now go into a cemetery and we can say, this grave is the daughter of the person in this grave, and that grave is the aunt of the person in this grave. And they all shared the same disease. And they were this tall, and their hair color was like this, and their skin color was like this, their eye color was like this, and they're distantly related to people in this other cemetery over there. We've never been able to do that before. And now that we can identify migrants in the archaeological record with a confidence we've never had before. And it changes the whole ballgame.
Chat about
The wagon, yeah, okay.
Okay, it says they have been spread for migration from Europe across the steppes eastward to China and influenced at least the formation of Chinese character.
He's talking about this image right here, that may have influenced the formation of at least one Chinese character. Somebody in the chat says that. That's really interesting. I've never heard that before. But this pot is dated 3300 BC and is one of the earliest two-dimensional images of a four-wheeled wagon that's been found archaeologically. So in 2015, the editors of Nature published this. This is the Reich article. The Lewis Lab article was published in the same issue. Massive migration from the steppe was a source for the Indo-European languages of Europe. And this is based on DNA evidence that showed incontrovertibly that there was no equivalent demographic event in the last 4,500 years. This shows the amount of Yamnaya ancestry in modern populations. The Yamnaya is in green, and the amount of early Neolithic farmer ancestry and hunter-gatherer ancestry in modern populations. And you can see that if you're the average typical Norwegian has more than 50% Yamnaya ancestry, and Yamnaya ancestry goes down as you move into the south of Europe. It's stronger in Northern Europe even today, and weaker in Southern Europe. And the archaeology actually bears that out, that that's the direction that the Yamnaya migrations went, more into Northern Europe than into Southern. The initial, this is the Yamnaya culture area, where they first invented pastoral nomadism, putting together horseback riding and wheeled vehicles. They then exported this economy into southeastern Europe, the Carpathian Basin, and the corded ware culture is 70% Yamnaya ancestry. And they also went all the way across Kazakhstan to the Altai Mountains, probably the origins of the Tocharian languages, the easternmost ones. And then later, there was a backward movement of these corded ware type people who had 70% Yamnaya ancestry and now about 30% European farmer ancestry, back through Russia into the steppes again, where they invented the chariot, spread through the steppes to the east, but now with ancestry looking more like corded ware. And then ultimately around 1500 BC into South Asia, where they established the foundation for the population that would emerge speaking Sanskrit. And I think that one of the things that explains their success, this is a diagram that shows separate networks of shared metal types in the Balkans, in Bulgaria, in the Copper Age. And you can see that there's shared metal types here, shared ones here, shared ones here. There's at least 3 different networks here. And now I'm going to go forward into the Bronze Age in the same place, and you can see that it's much, much more networked. And I think this was the advantage of Yamnaya, that they were so mobile that they were networked with each other over large regions. And that was the reason that their language ultimately spread. There are some other things that I could discuss. I think that Proto-Indo-European warfare, the Yamnaya warfare, was institutionalized certain kinds of war bands that I would not have wanted to live next door to. They also carried Yersinia pestis, the Black Death. It's an earlier version of it. Genetically, it's not the same as the medieval Black Death, and probably was not quite as fatal to have, but it was still a really serious disease that they carried with them. And that may have reduced the populations of the indigenous people who were out there before they got there. I just talked about their larger networks, which were not just networks of artifact sharing, but networks of alliance. And then there undoubtedly were attractions to what they were offering in terms of religion, poetry, and feasting. And there are a great number of similarities in religion, poetry, and feasting customs across the Indo-European speaking world. So that's a quick review of my theories on Indo-European origins and the history of migration in archaeology, and I'd be happy to take some questions.
Okay, here's one.
Okay.
I'll get you this last one. Why is pastoralism a superior strategy to agriculture, such that people would abandon the latter